The wind had carved the ridge into something that barely resembled Earth anymore. It rose from the desert floor, like the spine of some ancient creature, each vertebra a precise curve of compacted sand shaped by 10,000 years of relentless erosion. The woman stood at its crest, her shadow stretching long and distorted across the slope behind her, and felt the world go quiet in that way that makes the blood run cold. Not peaceful quiet, the quiet that comes before something breaks. She had been walking for 3 days since the supply cache she'd marked on her geological survey map turned out to be nothing but scattered metal and torn canvas, already claimed by the desert's appetite for anything human. The canteen at her hip held maybe 2 mouthfuls of water that tasted like rust and regret. Her boots were splitting at the seams, the left one stained dark with blood from where the leather had rubbed through her sock and into the heel beneath. Every step was a negotiation between the need to move and the body's increasingly desperate protests. The ridge had seemed like a gift when she'd spotted it that morning, a landmark that would let her orient herself against the endless sameness of the dunes. From its height, she might see something useful. A rock formation that could provide shade, a depression where water might collect after a storm, if there had been any storms. A way forward that wasn't just more sand bleeding into more sky. But now, standing at the top with the sun hammering down like judgment and the wind pulling at her hair with hot, dry fingers, she heard it, felt it, really, more than heard. A trembling that started so deep it seemed to come from the bones of the world itself. At first, she thought it was her legs giving out, the muscles finally surrendering after carrying her through heat that turned thought into soup, and exhaustion into something that lived in the marrow. She locked her knees, planted her feet wider. The trembling continued, grew stronger. The sand beneath her boots began to shift in tiny cascades, grains tumbling down the ridge face like the first whisper of an avalanche. She had felt earthquakes before, during her years studying sediment layers in the Atacama, but this was different. Earthquakes come from the tension between massive plates of rock grinding against each other, sudden and violent when they slip. They shake everything at once, democratic in their destruction. This trembling was focused, directional. It was coming from directly below her, as if something vast and deliberate was moving through the compressed sand and stone deep beneath the surface. The woman dropped into a crouch, pressing her palms flat against the ridge. Through the grit and heat-soaked sand, she could feel it more clearly now, a rhythmic pulsing, almost like a heartbeat if a heartbeat could be the size of a building. Each pulse sent vibrations radiating upward, making the ridge shudder like a living thing trying to shake her off. The wind carved formations around her, those precise curves that had taken millennia to form, began to blur at their edges as sand started flowing in earnest. Her mind raced through geological explanations with the desperate speed of someone who needs the world to make sense. Subsidence from collapsed caverns, underground water flows destabilizing the substrate. Even absurdly, some kind of industrial drilling operation, though she hadn't seen a sign of human activity in 6 days. None of it fit. The trembling was too regular, too purposeful. It was moving, rising. She scrambled backward from where she'd been standing, her damaged heel screaming protest that she ignored, with the practice of someone who'd learned that pain was just information, and survival meant sometimes you didn't listen to it. The spot where she'd stood moments before began to sink, the sand flowing inward like water circling a drain. The depression grew wider, faster than should be possible, and the trembling became a roar that she felt in her chest. The entire ridge was collapsing inward. She threw herself down the slope, half running, half falling, the sand giving way beneath her with each step, so that running became more like surfing down a moving wave of earth. Behind her, the ridge crest erupted, not with fire or lava, not with any volcanic fury, but with something worse, something that made her lizard brain scream in a language older than words. Sand fountained upward in a column that blotted out the sun, and through it, rising with the terrible patience of something that has never known defeat, came a shape. She caught only glimpses at first, turning her head as she slid and tumbled down the disintegrating ridge. Segmented plates of something that looked like chitin, but moved like muscle, each one the size of a car door. They were the color of old bone, cream white and smooth, and they caught the harsh sunlight in a way that made them seem to glow from within. Between the plates, in the gaps where they articulated against each other, she saw flesh that looked too wet, too raw, like an organ that should never see daylight. The the creature was massive. As the ridge collapsed and more of it emerged from the earth, she understood that what she was seeing was just a fraction of its total bulk. The segmented plates were arranged in rings around a cylindrical body, each ring perhaps 15 feet in diameter. They rotated slightly as it rose, screwing itself up through the sand with a motion that was sickeningly graceful. She hit the bottom of the ridge at a full run, momentum carrying her forward even as her legs tried to buckle. The sand there was firmer, older, compressed by time into something that wouldn't swallow her immediately. She ran without direction, just away, the animal imperative to escape overriding everything else. Behind her, the sound of the creature's emergence changed pitch, became a grinding roar mixed with something else, something that might have been breathing if anything that large could breathe. When she finally dared to look back, she wished she hadn't. The creature had emerged completely from the sand, and in the context of the desert's vast emptiness, it was an obscenity. 60 feet long at least, maybe more. The segmented body curved upward before bending back on itself, the whole mass hovering above the collapsed remains of the ridge. At what she desperately wanted to believe was its head, though it had no features that suggested anything as familiar as a head. The plates came together in a configuration that looked almost like a flower, if flowers were made of bone and nightmare. They were opening and closing in sequence, and with each opening, sand rushed into the space between them, pulled by some force she couldn't fathom. It was feeding, or breathing, or both. She forced herself to stop running, pressed herself against a formation of sandstone that rose from the desert floor like a broken tooth. Her lungs were on fire, her vision edged with black spots that pulsed in time with her heartbeat. The creature wasn't pursuing her. It seemed anchored above the collapsed ridge, its massive body swaying slightly as those flower-like plates continued their rhythmic opening and closing. Looking at it directly made something wrong happen in her head. Her eyes couldn't quite settle on its true shape, as if some part of her brain was refusing to process what it was seeing. The plates seemed to multiply when she wasn't looking directly at them, and the wet flesh between them appeared to writhe with movements that didn't match the creature's overall motion. She thought of deep-sea fish, those things that lived in pressures that would crush a human instantly, evolved in isolation so complete that they barely seemed like life at all. This thing had evolved beneath the desert, beneath hundreds of feet of sand and stone, in darkness absolute, in a world where the rules were different. And now, it was here, in her world, moving with the casual certainty of an apex predator that had never encountered anything it couldn't kill. The woman's training tried to reassert itself over the panic. She was a geologist, had spent years studying the structures beneath the Earth's surface. If this thing lived down there had to be tunnels. Systems of caves or caverns large enough to support something of that size. The desert above was hostile enough, but beneath it lay an entire hidden world, and she had just seen its surface barely crack open. The creature was sinking back down. The process was somehow worse than its emergence, more deliberate. The segmented plates rotated in reverse, threading the massive body back through the hole it had made. Sand flowed inward from all directions, pulled by whatever mechanism the creature used to move through solid earth. Within minutes, it was gone, the desert floor settling back into something that almost resembled normalcy. Almost. The ridge she had been standing on was simply gone, erased, replaced by a broad depression that already the wind was beginning to fill. She stayed pressed against the sandstone formation for a long time after the creature disappeared, long enough that the angle of the sun shifted and her shadow crept around the rock's curve. Her mind was trying to catalog what she'd seen, fit it into some framework of understanding, but kept sliding off the memory like water off glass. The size, the wrongness, the horrible implication that there might be more of them down there, moving through the sand like sharks through water. When she finally moved, it was because staying still meant dying, and some part of her had decided, with the stubborn irrationality of the survival instinct, that dying wasn't acceptable yet. Her canteen was nearly empty. The sun was beginning its descent toward evening, which in the desert meant the temperature would plummet from deadly heat to dangerous cold. She needed shelter, water, anything that might keep her alive through another night. The sandstone formation provided some shade as the sun lowered, and she used the brief respite to examine her injuries. The heel of her left foot was bad, the skin rubbed completely away in a patch the size of a coin, the exposed flesh angry red and weeping clear fluid. She had nothing to bandage it with that wasn't already filthy with sand and sweat. She settled for cutting a strip from the bottom of her shirt and wrapping it as tight as she could stand, knowing that by tomorrow it would be stuck to the wound, and removing it would be agony. Her hands were shaking, not from the injury, but from the delayed shock of what she'd witnessed. The creature, the size of it, the way it had moved through solid earth as if the sand was nothing but air. She had spent her career studying the deep structures of the earth, mapping sediment layers and ancient seabeds, and nothing in all that knowledge had prepared her for the reality of something alive, that large existing beneath the surface. As the sun touched the horizon and painted the desert in shades of blood and brass, she heard it again, the trembling, fainter this time, coming from somewhere to the north, but unmistakable. Another one, or the same one, moving through its hunting grounds. The sound seemed to go on forever, a bass note that she felt in her teeth, before fading back into the desert's usual silence. She drank the last of her water and tried to remember the survey maps she'd memorized before this expedition went wrong. There had been some notation about geological anomalies in this region, areas where ground-penetrating radar had returned strange readings, voids in the substrate that didn't match any known cave systems. The research team had marked them for follow-up investigation someday, when they had better equipment and more funding. Now she understood what those voids were. They were the tunnels, the highways of whatever those creatures were, running beneath the desert like veins beneath skin, invisible until you knew to look for them, and she was walking on top of them, every step a potential trigger for the things below. The temperature was dropping fast, the way it always did in deserts where there was nothing to hold the heat once the sun withdrew its attention. She had no shelter, no materials to make fire, nothing but the clothes on her back, and the knowledge that the night would try its best to kill her. The sandstone formation would block the wind at least, and she curled up against its base, trying to make herself as small as possible to conserve body heat. Sleep came in fits and starts, interrupted by cold that bit deep, and by dreams of segmented plates opening like flowers beneath her. Each time she woke, she pressed her ear to the ground, listening for that terrible trembling. Sometimes she heard it, faint and far away. Sometimes she couldn't tell if it was real or just the echo of memory. Dawn came with the color of infected wounds, red and yellow and purple bruising the eastern sky. She was shivering so hard her muscles ached, and the makeshift bandage on her heel had frozen to the wound with condensation and blood. She left it alone. Walking would warm her up, and by the time the sun was fully up, the cold would be the least of her problems. The desert stretched in every direction, empty and hostile and vast enough to swallow whole civilizations without trace. She chose east, toward the dawn, for no better reason than that it felt like moving toward something rather than away. Her body was a catalog of complaints, thirst that made her throat feel like it was full of sand, hunger that had moved past discomfort into a hollow ache, the grinding pain in her heel with every step, and underneath it all, a bone-deep exhaustion that made each movement feel like pushing through water. But she moved anyway, because stopping meant dying, and dying meant becoming nothing but another mystery of the desert, bones that might surface in 100 years to puzzle future explorers, if there were any, if the things beneath didn't rise and claim everything above. By mid-morning, she found the ruins. They emerged from the sand like broken teeth, stone blocks that had once been walls, foundations of structures that predated any civilization she knew. The stone was strange, darker than sandstone, covered in markings that erosion had worn almost smooth. She approached slowly, wary of unstable footing, aware that anywhere the ground looked disturbed might be dangerous now. The ruins formed a rough circle, maybe 50 feet across, the blocks arranged in a pattern that suggested deliberate construction, even if time had scrambled their original meaning. In the center of the circle, protected from the worst of the wind by the surrounding stones, she found what she'd been desperately hoping for, the dark stain of moisture in the sand. Not much, probably just condensation that collected in the pre-dawn cold and couldn't evaporate fast enough in the shade, but it was something. She dropped to her knees, ignored the protest from her injured heel, and began to dig. The sand came away in handfuls, and beneath it, the moisture increased. 3 feet down, her fingers found actual dampness. She widened the hole, made it as deep as her arm could reach, and waited. Water, when it comes in the desert, comes slowly. It seeps rather than flows, each drop a small miracle of physics and time. She watched the bottom of her hole with the intensity of prayer and saw the faintest darkening, the beginning of accumulation. It would take hours, but hours she had, and the shade of the ruins would keep her from cooking while she waited. She sat back against one of the fallen blocks and let herself, for just a moment, stop moving. The The stone was cool against her back, its surface carved with those worn markings that might have been writing or decoration or warning. She traced them with her fingers, feeling the grooves that wind and sand had softened, but not erased. Some of the markings looked almost familiar, patterns that reminded her of things she'd seen in other archaeological sites, spirals that might represent water or time, angular shapes that could be sun or shelter or danger, and one symbol that repeated throughout, carved deeper than the others, a segmented line that curved back on itself, almost like a snake eating its tail, except the segments were too regular, too deliberate. She pulled her hand back from the stone as if it had burned her. That symbol, those segments, she had just seen them, carved not in rock, but in living flesh, rising from beneath the ridge. The similarity was too precise to be coincidence. The people who had built this place, whoever and whenever they were, they had known. They had known about the creatures beneath the sand. The ruins took on a different character in her mind, not just remnants of some ancient settlement, but a warning, a memorial, maybe a trap. She looked at the pattern of stones again with new understanding. The circle wasn't random. It was a boundary, a mark of dangerous ground. The moisture that collected here wasn't just a useful accident of geology. It was bait, a way to draw the desperate to this exact spot. She should leave. Every instinct that had kept her alive this long was screaming at her to abandon the ruins and the promise of water and just go. Anywhere else. Anywhere but here. But her body was past the point of listening to instincts. The dehydration was severe enough that she could feel her thoughts turning sticky and slow, her tongue thick in her mouth, her lips cracked and bleeding. Without water, she would be dead by nightfall, and the knowledge of water here, even water that came with terrible implications, was more than she could walk away from. So she stayed, watched the hole she'd dug, watched the water accumulate with agonizing slowness while the sun climbed toward noon and the temperature rose until the air itself seemed to ripple. Her mind drifted, moving in and out of something that wasn't quite sleep, but wasn't fully conscious either. Time became elastic, meaningless. She came back to herself with the sun past its zenith and the hole full of muddy water that looked like the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. She leaned forward, cupped her hands, lifted the water to her mouth with shaking fingers. It tasted like minerals and earth and survival. She drank slowly, forcing herself to take small sips, even though her body was screaming to gulp it down. Too much too fast, and she'd just vomit it back up, waste what might be the last water she found. 3 cups. 4. Her stomach cramped with the sudden influx, but she kept it down. Already, she could feel the difference, her thoughts clearing, the desperate edge of panic receding. She refilled her canteen, careful not to stir up too much sediment, and allowed herself a small moment of hope. With water, she could survive long enough to find a way out of this desert, a way back to civilization and safety and explanations that made sense. The trembling started when she was securing the cap on her canteen. It was close this time, so close that dust rose from the stones around her, and the water in the hole she'd dug began to ripple in concentric circles. She froze, every muscle locked, unable to even breathe as the trembling grew stronger. The ruins seemed to amplify the sound, the stone blocks resonating with the vibrations from below, until the air itself hummed with bass notes too deep for hearing. The creature surfaced 40 feet from where she crouched. There was no warning beyond the trembling, no gradual emergence. One moment the desert floor was solid, the next it erupted in a geyser of sand and stone as the massive segmented body exploded upward. It was bigger than the one she'd seen before, or maybe just closer, close enough that she could see details that her mind immediately tried to reject. The segments weren't smooth like she'd thought. Up close, they were textured with millions of tiny pores, each one opening and closing in rhythm, and through them leaked a clear fluid that caught the sunlight and made the creature's hide glisten wetly. Between the segments, the exposed flesh pulsed with colors that shifted from deep purple to almost yellow, and she realized she was watching blood moving through transparent vessels, an internal system exposed to the air with no apparent concern. At the creature's front, those bone-white plates were fully open, arranged in concentric rings that spiraled inward toward a center she couldn't see and wasn't sure she wanted to. The spirals rotated, each ring moving independently, and the sound they made was like stone grinding on stone, mechanical and wrong. It hadn't noticed her yet, or maybe it had and simply didn't care. The creature swayed above the desert floor, suspended somehow, defying physics in a way that made her architect's understanding of load and stress and gravity scream in protest. Tons of flesh and chitin floating in the air like it weighed nothing, held up by forces she couldn't begin to understand. She had pressed herself flat against the stone block at her back, trying to become invisible, part of the ruins. The creature's front end swept back and forth in a searching pattern, those spiraling plates opening wider with each pass. And then it stopped, frozen, aimed directly at the circle of ruins where she crouched. At her. She understood two things simultaneously. First, that the ruins weren't a warning to stay away. They were markers, indicators of good hunting grounds where prey would come for water. Second, that she had maybe seconds before those plates focused on her location, and the creature moved with whatever terrible speed something that large could generate. She ran, threw herself away from the ruins with her injured heel screaming, and her recently rehydrated muscles feeling like rubber. The creature responded instantly, that massive body whipping around with a speed that violated everything she knew about physics and inertia. It didn't move through the air. It moved through the sand beneath her feet, burrowing with that same screwing motion she'd seen before, creating pressure waves in the ground that made running feel like trying to sprint across a waterbed. The desert floor buckled ahead of her. She changed direction, scrambling laterally as the creature surfaced again, this time close enough that she could smell it. A reek of deep earth and something organic gone wrong, like meat preserved in minerals. Sand rained down around her, stinging her exposed skin, getting in her eyes and mouth. She had no plan beyond movement, no strategy except to not be where the creature expected her to be. It was hurting her, she realized. Each time it surfaced, it forced her in a specific direction, away from any rock formation that might provide cover, toward open sand where she would be completely exposed. It had done this before, evolved to do this, hunt things that ran, so she stopped running. The decision was instinct and insanity in equal measure, but the woman had learned long ago that survival sometimes meant doing the thing that felt most wrong. She dropped flat to the sand, spread her limbs wide to distribute her weight, and pressed her face to the ground. Became a starfish, a non-threatening shape, something that might register as not prey to whatever senses the creature used. The trembling beneath her was constant now, so intense her teeth rattled. She could feel the creature circling, sense its massive bulk moving through the sand in a pattern that would bring it directly beneath her. Every nerve in her body was screaming to move, to run, to do anything except lie still, while something the size of a bus moved underneath her position. She held still. The sand next to her exploded as one of the creature's segments breached, so close that she could have reached out and touched it if she'd been completely insane. The segment was as thick as her torso, and this close she could see that the pores in its surface were moving, cilia, or something like them, waving in the air. The clear fluid that leaked from between the plates had a consistency like syrup, viscous and oddly reflective. The segment sank back into the sand, rose again 10 feet away, then 20 feet. The creature was leaving, moving away from her, its interest lost. She had become, by stillness, invisible to whatever hunting sense it possessed. She didn't move for a long time after the trembling faded, didn't let herself believe she was alive until the sun had shifted noticeably in the sky, and the desert had returned to its usual hostile silence. When she finally lifted her head, her whole body was shaking with something beyond exhaustion, beyond fear. She had been seconds from death, from being pulled beneath the sand to feed something that should not exist. The ruins were destroyed. Where the circle of stones had been was now just a crater, the ancient blocks tumbled and broken, the water hole buried under tons of sand. The creature had surfaced directly through the center of the ruins, either chasing her or simply not caring that the structures were there. Millennia of patient stonework erased in moments. She retrieved her canteen from where she'd dropped it in her initial flight, grateful to find it intact, and forced herself to orient. The sun was past mid-afternoon, which gave her maybe 3 hours until dusk. She needed to be far away from this area before dark, far from any place where moisture might collect, any feature that might make her a target. The open desert was paradoxically safer than anywhere that offered shelter or water, because the creatures hunted where prey came to them. Her heel was bleeding again, the makeshift bandage soaked through. She rewrapped it with a fresh strip torn from her shirt, and tried not to think about infection, or how many days she could keep walking on an open wound before her body simply gave up. One foot in front of the other, that was all she could control. The desert floor showed signs now that she knew what to look for. Depressions where something large had moved beneath the surface. Areas where the sand was disturbed in patterns too regular to be wind. Once, she saw what looked like a segment of shed chitin, bleached white by sun and time, half buried in a dune. She gave it a wide berth, unwilling to even touch something that had been part of one of those creatures. Dusk came with winds that carried voices, or sounded like they did, the air moving across the empty spaces in a way that created almost words. She had learned to ignore the auditory hallucinations that came with dehydration and exhaustion, but these felt different, more present. The woman found a flat area of hardpan, ground compressed over centuries, until it was nearly as solid as concrete, and made camp in the most generous interpretation of that word. She had no fire, no shelter, nothing but the clothes on her back, and the water in her canteen, and the knowledge that she had survived another day in a place that wanted her dead. The stars came out in their thousands, brilliant and cold, and utterly indifferent. She traced constellations she had known since childhood, finding comfort in their predictability. The universe beyond the atmosphere didn't care if she lived or died, but at least it was honest about it. The trembling woke her sometime after midnight. She had fallen into exhausted sleep despite the cold, despite lying on bare ground, despite everything, and the vibrations in the earth brought her back to consciousness with her heart already hammering. It was distant, maybe a mile away, but in the dead silence of desert night, distance meant little. She could hear it clearly, that grinding mechanical sound of the creatures moving through their tunnels. She sat up, wrapped her arms around her knees, and listened. The trembling came in waves, sometimes from one direction, sometimes from another. There were multiple creatures moving through the network of tunnels beneath her, and the realization of just how extensive that network must be made her feel very small and very lost. The desert wasn't just a hostile surface environment. It was the roof of another world entirely, one populated by things that had evolved in darkness and pressure, that moved through solid earth the way sharks moved through water. By dawn, she had made a decision. She couldn't keep wandering aimlessly, couldn't keep hoping to stumble across rescue or escape. The creatures made the desert impassable for anyone on foot, anyone who didn't know where the tunnels ran. But she was a geologist. She had spent years learning to read stone and sediment, to understand the structures beneath the Earth's surface. If she could find a way to map the tunnels, to understand the pattern of the creatures' movements, she might be able to navigate around them. It was a slim hope, but it was something other than just waiting to die. She spent that day studying the ground, looking for patterns in the disturbances, in the areas where sand had been churned by passage from below. The creatures seemed to prefer certain depths, certain types of substrate. They avoided areas of bedrock where the stone was too dense, and they moved most frequently in the sand seas, where the material was loose enough for easy passage. The ruins she'd found had been in a border area, where sandy soil overlay harder layers, and she realized that was deliberate. The ancient people who'd built them had understood the creatures' preferences, had marked the boundaries of safe and dangerous ground. If she could find more ruins, she might be able to piece together a map, a way out. The search nearly killed her. 2 more days of walking on her damaged heel, of rationing water that was running low again, of scanning the horizon for any sign of stonework in a landscape that seemed determined to erase all evidence of human presence. She found scraps, fragments of carved stone half buried in dunes, single blocks that might once have been part of larger structures. Each one she examined for that repeating symbol, the segmented line, and each time she found it, she marked the location in her mind, building a map from pieces of ancient warning. A pattern emerged. The ruins formed a line, or what had been a line before centuries of sand movement had scattered them. They ran roughly east to west, parallel to a distant range of mountains that shimmered on the horizon like a mirage. Following the line meant moving through areas where the trembling was less frequent, where the ground felt more stable underfoot. It wasn't safe. Nowhere in this desert was safe, but it was safer. On the 4th day after her encounter at the circular ruins, she found the canyon. It cut across the desert floor like a wound, 50 feet deep and narrow enough that she could have thrown a stone across it. The walls were striated stone, layers of sediment laid down over millions of years, and at the bottom, impossible and beautiful, she saw the dark gleam of water, not the muddy seepage of a condensation hole, but actual flowing water, probably fed by some deep aquifer that the canyon had cut through. The problem was getting down. The walls were nearly vertical, the stone crumbling in places, and her body was past the point where she could trust it to do anything athletic. But water, actual water. The promise of it made the rational part of her brain shut down, and the desperate survivor take over. She found a section where erosion had created a rough path, more suggestion than actual trail, and started down. Every handhold was a gamble, every foothold a prayer. Twice, chunks of stone came away in her grip and tumbled into the canyon below with sounds that echoed like thunder. Her heel, which she had stopped bothering to bandage because the bandages just got soaked with blood and sand anyway, left marks on the stone as she descended. Halfway down, she heard the trembling. It was different in the canyon, amplified and distorted by the stone walls until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. She froze, clinging to the canyon wall with fingers that were starting to shake, and tried to locate the source. Below her, above her, inside the walls themselves. The vibrations made small stones rain down from above, stinging her scalp and shoulders. She had to keep moving. Staying on the wall when a creature emerged would mean falling, and the canyon floor was far enough down that the fall would break bones at minimum. She forced her body to move, faster than was safe, scrambling down the crumbling path with the sound of the trembling growing louder. She was 10 feet from the canyon floor when the wall beside her exploded. The creature that emerged was smaller than the others she'd seen, maybe only 20 feet long, but the designation of smaller meant nothing when it was erupting from solid rock an arm's length from her position. Segments of bone-white chitin caught the light streaming down from above, and the wet flesh between them pulsed with colors that seemed too bright, too saturated, like the creature was radioactive with its own life. She let go of the wall, dropped those final 10 feet and hit the canyon floor hard enough to feel something twist in her ankle, hard enough to drive the breath from her lungs. The water was right there, 3 feet away, close enough to touch, but she couldn't move. Her body had finally hit its limit. The ankle she'd just injured wasn't bearing weight, and her heel had left a streak of blood on the stone. The creature hung suspended in the hole it had made, its front end weaving back and forth in that searching pattern. Those plate-like structures at its head were opening and closing, and she realized she could see through them when they opened, see into a cavity that was lined with something that looked like crystalline structures, geometric and precise. They caught the light and threw it back in rainbow fragments, beautiful and alien and completely without mercy. She dragged herself toward the water, using her arms to pull her body across the canyon floor. The creature tracked the movement, responding to the vibrations she was making against the stone. Its body began to withdraw back into the wall, pulling itself into the tunnel it had made, and she understood that it was repositioning, getting ready to surface directly beneath her. The water, when she finally got her face to it, was cold enough to make her gasp. She drank in desperate gulps, ignoring the pain in her ribs from the fall, ignoring everything except the need to get as much water into her body as possible before the creature finished whatever it was doing. She filled her canteen, fumbled the cap on with shaking hands, and looked for any way out of the canyon that didn't involve climbing back up the wall she'd descended. The canyon ran in both directions, narrowing to the east and widening to the west. To the west, maybe 100 yards away, she could see where the walls broke down into something that might be climbable. She started crawling toward it, dragging her injured ankle, leaving a trail of blood and water behind her. The canyon floor erupted ahead of her. The creature surfaced directly in her path, rising from the stone with that horrible screwing motion, blocking her escape. It was fully emerged now, hovering above the canyon floor with the water streaming from its segments, and she could see how it moved through solid matter. The plates weren't just armor. They rotated independently, each one generating some kind of field or force that liquefied the stone around them. The creature wasn't burrowing through earth. It was swimming through it, turning solid matter temporarily fluid with whatever physics-breaking ability evolution had granted it. She couldn't go forward, couldn't go back. The walls were too steep to climb quickly, and her body was done, finished, held together by nothing but stubbornness and the basic biological imperative to not die. The creature's front end oriented on her, those crystalline structures in its head cavity beginning to pulse with light. And then the canyon filled with sound. It came from everywhere at once, a harmonic that made the stone walls vibrate in sympathy. Not the grinding mechanical sound of the creatures moving through tunnels, but something higher, more complex. Musical, almost, if music could be made from mathematics and stone. The creature responded immediately, its body going rigid, the plates at its head snapping closed in a pattern too fast to follow. The woman looked up and saw them. Other creatures, smaller ones, emerging from holes in the canyon walls all around her. Dozens of them, each one maybe 5 or 6 feet long, their segments shimmering with colors that shifted through the spectrum. They were making the sound, generating it somehow, and the large creature was responding to it, retreating. The massive body withdrew back into the tunnel it had made, moving in reverse with the same impossible grace it had shown surfacing. The smaller creatures maintained their harmonic until the large one was completely gone, until the trembling in the stone had faded to nothing. Then they turned their attention to her. She waited for them to attack, for those plate-like heads to open and reveal whatever feeding mechanism they possessed. But they just hung there, suspended in the air, regarding her with senses she couldn't begin to understand. And slowly, one by one, they withdrew back into their holes, disappearing into the canyon walls until she was alone again. The woman sat on the canyon floor and started laughing, a sound that was more hysteria than humor. The creatures had saved her, or maybe they'd just been protecting their territory from a larger predator. Either way, she was alive, and the improbability of that was enough to break something inside her that had been holding too tight for too long. She cried for a while after the laughing stopped, great racking sobs that hurt her ribs and used up moisture she couldn't afford to lose, but needed to release anyway. Then she pulled herself together with the practice of someone who'd survived worse than this, and dragged her body to the western end of the canyon, where the walls broke down into slopes she could climb. It took her the rest of the day to get out of the canyon. Her ankle was swelling, the joint already twice its normal size and hot to the touch. The heel of her other foot had stopped bleeding only because there wasn't enough moisture left in her body to make blood. She was sunburned on top of everything else. Her face and arms blistered, her lips split and bleeding, but she had water, a full canteen and the knowledge of where to find more if she needed it. And she had seen something that changed everything she thought she understood about the creatures. They weren't just mindless predators moving through the dark. They had social structure, communication, behavior patterns that suggested something more than simple hunting instinct. They were intelligent, or some of them were. The implications of that were too large to process in her current state. She focused instead on the immediate problem of survival, finding shelter before dark, rationing water, keeping weight off her ankle. The mountains on the horizon were closer now, close enough that she could make out individual peaks, maybe 2 days of walking if she could walk. If her body held together that long, she found a depression between 2 dunes as the sun set, deep enough to provide some protection from the wind. Sleep came fast and hard, the kind of sleep that was more like losing consciousness, and she didn't wake until the sun was already high the next morning. Her ankle was worse. The swelling had spread halfway up her calf, and the joint had gone through pain into numbness. She couldn't put any weight on it at all. Walking was impossible. The woman sat in the sand and ran through her options with the clinical detachment of someone looking at a problem that didn't directly involve them dying. She could stay here and wait for rescue that would never come. She could try to crawl toward the mountains, which would take weeks she didn't have. Or she could do the thing she'd been avoiding thinking about since the first time she'd seen the creatures. She could go down into the tunnels. The idea was insane on every level. The tunnels were the creatures' domain, their hunting grounds, their home. Going into them voluntarily was suicide. But the alternative was death by exposure or dehydration, and at least in the tunnels, she might find water, might find some shelter from the sun, might discover something about the creatures that could help future explorers avoid her fate, if there were any future explorers, if the world above survived whatever was happening beneath it. She spent that day preparing, used the knife from her survey kit to cut her damaged boot away from her swollen ankle, fashioned a crude crutch from a piece of sun-bleached wood she found half buried in the sand, drank water, and tried to build up whatever reserves of strength her body still possessed. And as the sun lowered toward the horizon, she dragged herself to the nearest sign of disturbance in the sand, the nearest indication of a tunnel beneath. The ground was soft there, disturbed by recent passage. She dug with her hands, clearing away sand until she found the tunnel opening. It was maybe 3 feet across, the walls smooth and glassy where the creature's passage had transformed the sand into something temporarily solid. The tunnel angled down into darkness absolute. She had a small LED light on her survey kit, one of those modern ones that would run for days on a single battery. She clicked it on, watched the beam disappear into the dark, and made her decision. Staying on the surface meant certain death. Going down meant probable death, but with at least the chance of learning something, of finding something, of surviving in a way that honored the geologist's instinct to know, to understand, to map the unknown. The woman lowered herself into the tunnel. The walls were cool against her skin, almost pleasant after the brutal heat of the surface. She used her crutch to brace herself, moving in a half-controlled slide down the angled passage. Her light threw shadows that moved with her, distorting her shape against the tunnel walls. The tunnel went deeper than she expected, angling down at maybe 30 degrees, smooth and regular. After 50 feet, it intersected with another tunnel, this one larger, running perpendicular. She paused at the junction, listening. The silence in the tunnels was different from the silence above, heavier somehow, like the weight of all that sand and stone pressing down. But there was no trembling, no sound of movement. She chose the larger tunnel, reasoning that bigger tunnels meant bigger creatures, which meant they were probably used less frequently. Smaller creatures would use smaller passages, and she'd already seen that the smaller ones seemed less immediately hostile. The logic was shaky, but it was something to base a decision on. The tunnel network was vast. She realized that within the first hour of moving through it, passages branched and intersected in patterns that suggested deliberate construction rather than random burrowing. Some tunnels had walls that were smooth as glass. Others were rough, lined with what looked like the shed segments of chitin she'd seen on the surface. And everywhere, every surface, was marked with those same symbols she'd seen on the ruins. Segmented lines, spirals, angular shapes. This wasn't just a tunnel system, it was architecture. The creatures had built this, or something had, ages ago, and the creatures now used it the way humans used roads, an infrastructure of passage beneath the entire desert, hidden from the surface, older than history. She found water in a chamber where 3 tunnels converged. It pooled in a depression in the floor, clear and cold, fed by some underground source. She drank carefully, refilled her canteen, and allowed herself to rest. Her ankle was agony even without bearing weight, and the exhaustion was like a physical force pushing her down. She slept there in the chamber, her light switched off to conserve battery, wrapped in a darkness so complete it had texture. She woke to the sound of movement. Something large was coming through one of the tunnels, moving fast, the grinding mechanical sound of plates rotating against each other echoing off the walls. She grabbed her crutch, her light, scrambled toward the smallest of the 3 tunnels, the one she hoped a large creature couldn't follow her into. The beam of her light bounced wildly as she moved, throwing fragments of illumination across the chamber. She saw it for just an instant, before she made it into the small tunnel, one of the massive ones, maybe 60 feet long, filling the large passage completely as it moved through with that terrible screwing motion. The plates at its head were open, those crystalline structures inside pulsing with light that responded to her LED beam, and she understood that it had been attracted by her light, drawn to it the way deep-sea creatures are drawn to bioluminescence. She switched the light off and pressed herself as far back into the small tunnel as she could get, heard the creature enter the chamber, heard the scraping of its segments against stone. It was searching, moving back and forth, those head plates opening and closing in sequence. The sound filled the chamber, filled her head, made coherent thought almost impossible, and then it stopped. The silence after the noise was worse than the noise itself. She could hear her own heartbeat, could hear the rush of blood in her ears, could hear the tiny sounds of her own breathing magnified by fear and adrenaline. The creature was still in the chamber. She could sense its presence, the displacement of air, the slight vibrations in the stone beneath her. Minutes passed, hours. She lost track of time in the absolute dark, couldn't tell if her eyes were open or closed. Her mind started to fracture, to see lights that weren't there, to hear sounds that might have been real, or might have been her brain trying to make sense of sensory deprivation. When the creature finally moved again, it was sudden and close. She felt the current of air from its passage, felt the tunnel wall shudder as something massive moved past the opening. Then the grinding sound began to fade, growing distant as the creature moved away through the network of tunnels. She didn't move for a long time after that, didn't trust that the creature was really gone, didn't trust her own senses in the dark. When she finally clicked her light back on, the chamber was empty, the water still pooled in its depression, everything exactly as it had been except for fresh scratches on the stone where the creature's segments had scraped the walls. She couldn't stay in the tunnels. That was clear now. The creatures used them too frequently, and down here in their element, she had no chance of escape. But getting back to the surface meant climbing, and with her ankle, climbing was nearly impossible. She was trapped, caught between the hostile environment above and the hunting grounds below. The woman sat in the chamber and faced the reality of her situation, with the stark clarity that comes when all illusions are stripped away. She was going to die down here. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. Her body was past the point of recovery without medical intervention she couldn't access. The ankle was infected. She could feel the heat of it spreading up her leg. The heel of her other foot was a constant source of pain. She was dehydrated, malnourished, exhausted beyond measure, but she wasn't dead yet. And as long as she wasn't dead, she could still do something useful. She could map the tunnels, document what she'd learned about the creatures, leave some record for whoever might find her remains, if anyone ever did. She had her survey notebook, waterproof, and still mostly intact in her kit. She began to draw, sketching the tunnel layout from memory, marking the chambers and intersections, noting the locations of water and the symbols carved into the walls. The work gave her purpose, something to focus on besides the pain and fear. 3 pages of careful notation. 4, 5. She documented the creatures' behavior, their size ranges, the way they responded to light and vibration. Wrote down her theory about the tunnel network being constructed rather than naturally formed. Described the smaller creatures that had saved her in the canyon, the harmonic they'd produced, the social behavior that suggested intelligence. On the 6th page, she wrote about the ruins, the pattern they'd formed on the surface, the symbols that matched the tunnel markings, the implications that surface cultures and underground systems were connected, had interacted, had known about each other. On the 7th page, her hand started shaking too much to write clearly. The infection was spreading faster than she'd thought possible. Or maybe it wasn't infection at all. Maybe it was just her body finally surrendering to accumulated trauma. She managed a few more lines, a warning to anyone who might read this. The desert is not empty. It's the surface of another world. Be careful where you dig. She must have passed out then, because when she came back to consciousness, her light was dimmer, the battery dying, and there were sounds in the chamber. Multiple creatures, she thought, moving through the tunnels nearby. The trembling in the stone was constant now, coming from all directions. She couldn't tell anymore if it was real, or if her failing nervous system was manufacturing sensations. The woman tried to stand, couldn't, settled for dragging herself toward the tunnel that led upward, the one she'd entered through. Her crutch was gone, lost somewhere in the dark. She used her elbows, her one good leg, crawled inch by painful inch across the stone floor. The sounds were getting closer, or maybe they were getting further away. Distance and direction were becoming meaningless concepts. She made it maybe 20 feet before her body simply stopped responding. Muscles that had been pushed past every reasonable limit, finally refusing to contract. She lay on her stomach on the tunnel floor, her cheek pressed to stone, and watched her light dim to almost nothing. The battery was dying, and with it, the last of her ability to navigate the dark. In the failing light, she saw them, the smaller creatures, dozens of them, emerging from side tunnels to surround her. They hung in the air, their segments shimmering with those shifting colors, and as her light finally went out, they began to glow, bioluminescence that started as a faint shimmer and grew until the tunnel was bathed in cold blue light. They weren't attacking. They were just watching, regarding her with whatever senses they possessed. The woman wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it, dying in a tunnel beneath the desert, surrounded by alien creatures that had decided to bear witness to her death. It seemed both tragic and somehow appropriate, but she didn't die. The creatures began to move in coordinated patterns, their bioluminescence pulsing in rhythm. They were generating that harmonic again, the same sound she'd heard in the canyon, and this close, she could feel it resonating in her bones. The sound built and built until it was almost painful, and then something changed. The stone beneath her began to move, not violently, but flowing like water, carrying her upward. The creatures were moving her through the tunnel system, using that same reality-breaking ability they used to swim through solid earth. She felt the stone flow around her body, supporting her, lifting her, carrying her up through passages she hadn't mapped. The movement was gentle, almost careful, and the bioluminescent light of the creatures lit the way like stars in the darkness. She surfaced maybe an hour before dawn, the creatures placing her on the desert floor with a precision that suggested practice, then withdrawing back into their tunnels. The last thing she saw before they disappeared was that same segmented symbol on the stone at the tunnel entrance, carved deep and clear, and she finally understood what it meant. Not a warning, not a threat, a promise, a covenant between surface and depth, between the world above and the world below. The creatures would let some pass, would even help, sometimes, when the need was great enough and the intent was peaceful. But they would defend their territory from those who came with violence or greed, or the desire to exploit. The sun rose over the desert, painting the dunes in shades of gold and amber. The woman lay where the creatures had left her, too weak to move, and watched the light spread across the sand. She could see the mountains clearly now, close enough that she could make out the details of vegetation on their lower slopes. Rescue was maybe a day away for someone who could walk. For her, it might as well be on the moon. She closed her eyes against the growing light and waited. Maybe someone would come. Maybe the research team she'd been separated from would mount a search. Maybe the desert would finally finish what it had started. Either way, she had done what she could, survived as long as possible, documented what she'd found, given future explorers a chance to understand what waited beneath the sand. The wind picked up, carrying voices that weren't quite voices, sounds that might have been the desert itself, speaking in a language she almost understood. She thought about the creatures, about their vast network of tunnels beneath the wasteland, about the intelligence she'd witnessed that suggested awareness and purpose, and a history that extended far beyond human reckoning. The desert wasn't empty. It had never been empty. Humans had just been looking in the wrong direction, mapping the wrong spaces, missing the civilization that existed below their feet while they charted the stars above their heads. She must have slept then, because the next thing she knew, there were voices, real ones this time, human ones, and hands on her shoulders, a bottle of water against her lips. The rescue team had found her somehow, had followed some trail or signal she couldn't remember leaving. They were asking questions she couldn't answer, words that meant less than the wind sounds, and she let herself be carried, let consciousness fade. She woke in a hospital 2 days later, her body wrapped in bandages and connected to machines that beeped with reassuring regularity. The infection in her ankle had been severe, nearly cost her the leg, but they'd caught it in time. The heel would heal. The dehydration was corrected. The sunburn would fade. Physically, she would recover. But she couldn't tell them what she'd seen. When she tried, the words came out confused and fragmented. Dreams and hallucinations born of dehydration, they said. Nothing in the desert but sand and heat, and the mind's desperate attempt to make sense of isolation. They nodded and made notes and adjusted her medication, and she understood that the truth would sound like madness to people who had never seen what moved beneath the dunes. Her survey notebook had survived, waterproof casing protecting the pages she'd filled in the tunnels. But when she looked at it, hoping to use it as proof, she found only blank pages. The writing had disappeared, faded away like it had never existed. Or maybe it had been written in something that only showed up in the dark, in the bioluminescent light of creatures that officially didn't exist. She was released after a week, sent home with a cane and instructions to stay out of the desert for at least 6 months. The research program she'd been part of was suspended, the area where she'd been lost deemed too dangerous for field work without better support infrastructure. No one would go back. No one would explore the tunnels she'd mapped in her mind. No one would verify what she'd witnessed, except her. Someday, when her body healed and her resources allowed, she would go back, would return to the desert with better equipment and clearer purpose, would find those tunnels again and document them properly, create a record that couldn't be dismissed or explained away, because the desert was not empty, and the things that lived beneath it deserved to be understood, not as threats or resources to exploit, but as the native inhabitants of a world humans had barely begun to explore. The woman stood at her apartment window, looking out over the city, and thought about segmented forms moving through the dark beneath her feet, about harmonics that could reshape reality, about the promise carved in stone at 1,000 forgotten sites scattered across the wastelands. She had survived the desert, but the desert had not finished with her. It had marked her, changed her, given her purpose, and someday she would return. If you want to know what happens when she goes back, when she discovers what truly lies in the deepest tunnels beneath the sand, subscribe to Dark Desert Survival. This is just the beginning of her journey, and the desert keeps many more secrets. Leave a comment and tell me, what do you think she'll find when she returns? What mysteries wait in the dark beneath the dunes?